Alright, so, a couple days ago, Riot posted up this article, just a dev talk on what they have found out about teamfight tactics and kind of auto battlers in general and how to develop them. And I wanted to go through a handful of the things that they brought up. So, one of the first things they brought up was this going back to set 2. Was spell impact and excitement, that your spells some of your high impact stuff that was happening in the game was kind of invisible. You didn't really see it. It was just kind of happening in the background. So, like, a good example is, like, Kha'Zix or Ashe. And Twitch. Those three in particular I can call out. They could dominate a board, but you never really notice because the visual effects that they were having was very minimal. Nocturne's another example where they're just kind of hitting things and stuff's dying everywhere, but you don't really see the effects. You don't really know what's happening. That's something that they've worked on, and they call out particularly like Darius dunks, Ziggs bombs, Vayne tumbles, more bright effects. It's a good trend visually as like a casual user that you see big things happen and big things are happening. There's a couple things on this set I do think they missed. Like they say Gangplank's like really big. I think Gangplank's actually like not very obvious as to what's going on. I think the explosion is kind of a very minor effect, and what you really see is a bunch of dead units. So it's positive that we're going to be seeing more of this, and I'm glad. And it helps with this part too, where they talk about combat clarity, making sure that you understand what's actually happening on the battlefield visually. That everything's kind of coherent and understandable, just visually. So that's just a minor thing, but that was a big emphasis when they were going into set 3. Did they do it well? Yeah, I think they did it well. It wasn't a big emphasis point for me, but for Riot, it was pretty important. Champion balance and design. This one we're going to talk a bit more about. So, on the first half of set 3, so before 3.5 and even before some of the patches in set 3, the game was kind of ruled by your 1-cost carries, your 2-cost carries, your 4-cost carries, and occasionally your 5-cost fairies. There were no carries at 3-cost. There was basically Shaco, and that was kind of about it. The idea was that Master Yi and Syndra were supposed to be carries, but they weren't. Instead, everyone was running almost exclusively hyper-rolling 1-cost carries or running a 4-cost carry. And that was pretty much about it. So they made a bunch of adjustments, and now there is a crap load of set 3-cost carries, along with some 5-cost carries that were underperforming at the time. So, but what happened because of this is now all those 1-cost carries and 2-cost carries, people stopped playing them. They kind of fell out of favor. So, like, the Poppy Candyland build or the Xayah Hyper Roll, people just kind of stopped doing that as we got later in the set 3. And slow rolling kind of became more favored for running those builds over Hyper Roll, but even so, those builds, we just did not see them nearly as much. So, their point is they want to make carries at all levels satisfying, which is a good goal. But there is only there's a couple minor issues with this. The biggest one being, and they do call this out, we're still trying to figure out what a great 2-cost champion looks like and what their exact role on the team. So, I want to go into this point because this is a point that I think I've made before. Making a good 2-cost champion that's a carry is difficult, but it's not really a champion design issue. It's a gameplay issue. 2-cost is the hardest thing to find in the game, because in the early game, you stock up on 1-cost and get maybe a couple of 2-costs. You don't carry a lot of 2-costs in the early game for eco reasons. You don't want to carry a bunch of 2-costs, just for the same reason that you almost always insta-sell 3-costs you get in the early game. You're just going to run a bunch of 1-costs and maybe a 1-star 2-cost. It's pretty rare in the early game to have a 2-star 2-cost. because the eco hits pretty high. At the same time, in the late game, you don't find 2-cost champions, ever. At level 7, you peak for finding your 3-cost. At level 8, you're starting... So at level 7, you're going down on finding 2-cost. You're peaking at 3-cost. So you're basically peaking your 2-cost at like level 5 or 6. I'm not sure the exact numbers, but it's either 5 or 6 that you're going to be peaking to find your 2-cost. You can't stay at those levels. Those levels are dangerous levels to stay on. Because you're not finding all the champions you really want to be finding. You don't want to roll down at those levels. It's part of the reason why slow rolling became more popular than hyper rolling, is because hyper rolling wastes a lot of eco, whereas slow rolling doesn't waste all of that eco. So what this means is that finding a 2-cost champion that's really good and can carry the game is difficult because it's very hard to 3-star it. This really wasn't a problem in set 2 because of the way eco worked. You had a lot more gold at the beginning of the game, so it really wasn't that bad to hoard a bunch of 2-costs. You can't really hoard 2-costs. You have to sell them to make your eco. So, while expecting to find carries at all costs, I think this is going to be a problem if they continue with the percentages that they have now for finding champions on rolls. Major versus minor traits. So this is more design function, but it's there's really 2 issues here. One is that some minor traits just weren't good, and you just kind of ran the minor trait to get to the major trait. A good example of this was Cyber. So you never flex Cyber 3. There was no reason to ever flex Cyber 3, because that means you had to put items on those Cybers when your composition was probably off in a different direction. It was always just better to go Cyber 6. So if you had a Cyber 3 opening, I would say probably 4 out of every 5 games you finished with Cyber 6. You didn't transition elsewhere. At the same time, you almost always went Cyber 3 before transitioning to Cyber 6. There was no other path to Cyber 6. You always had Cyber 3 to go into Cyber 6. That's a design issue. That's kind of just the nature of having a trait that only does anything when you put items on it. So I highly doubt we are ever going to see a trait like Cyber again, because it locks, while it doesn't seem like a big issue, it locks that trait into being like just that trait, and a very linear trait at that. You just kind of end up having to play it this way, with no other way to go about it. You could mix the minor traits a bit, and you could tinker around with your item optimization within Cyber 6, but the path to it was almost always the same. Cyber 3 to Cyber 6. The other issue that came up was that some of the Battlecast was very similar. They point out Battlecast was pretty similar, and I understand that too. It's like you ran Battlecast early, so you would run Battlecast late. Like you didn't just like make Battlecast late, or you didn't just run. Well, if you ran Battlecast early, you almost always were going Battlecast late, because it's just how that builds up. While the other issue was, I like to call them flex traits. So from my perspective, Chrono and Celestial are what I call flex traits. Mystic's another good example, I think, of a flex trait. And what I mean by a flex trait is your composition is not that. Your composition is not Celestial. Your composition is not Cyber. Your composition is not Mystic. Your composition is you're playing stuff and you're flexing to add this in to get the bonus minor trait. Now, from what it seems like Riot's point of view is that you should be able to play this at like Chrono 6. That should be a thing people should be doing. My perspective is that's not a thing you should be doing. I think having these as flex traits is probably a much better way to view them, rather than just linearly playing just vomit them all on the field and have good things happen. They're much more valuable in the game as being viewed as a flexible thing that you can add to a composition interchangeably. So maybe in some compositions I play Chrono 2. Other compositions I'll play Mystic 2. Other competitions I'll play Celestial 2. I think that's a much better way to go about viewing it. It seems that Riot kind of disagrees with that, and they want to push making that this is something that is playable. And that's why this part's labeled major versus minor traits. They made this as a major trait. Like, you could go up to 6 with it. But it was really only played as a minor trait. Moving on to the Spatula. Oh, the Spatula. So they get it out of the way pretty early that Spatula really wasn't an issue with this set, with the exception of Demolition of Spatula. I would argue that Protector Spatula was a problem too, but we'll get to that argument later. Demo Spat was a mistake. It's pretty clear from reading this. Riot understands Demo Spat was a mistake. I think the Demo Trait was a mistake, but that's kind of just that. There were issues with the Spatula in set 2 because certain Spatula items had a power creep that was like incredibly high. Notably the Blade Master Spat. The Blade Master Spat basically forced a rework on Blade Master because Blender was like unbeatable. At the same time, you had another good example was Mage's Cap Malphite in set 2. That was teetering, in my opinion, on levels of being a little bit overpowered. So because of that, they removed that spats basically showed up in every carousel. It kind of used to be that a spat would just show up in like every carousel, every other carousel, somewhere around those lines. So it's not in this article, but they did note how carousels are going to be distributed out anymore. We're no longer going to be in set 4, I should say. We're no longer going to have Mort Dog carousels, which we'll talk about carousels later. Most carousels will be 8 items plus 1 random double. I think that was like 85%. 10% of carousels would be all items and 1 spatula, and then some would be like 4 spatulas and the rest random items. That's the thought of what they're moving to. I think the biggest thing, and we'll get to the carousel issues later, but regarding spatula is, as long as they don't have units that when you give the spat are kind of busted, it's fine. The problem is, like, the nature of this game is that there's a lot of combinations you have to test to make sure that something is not totally busted. In the case of Blade Master Spat, in set 2, Nocturne plus Blade Master Spat was busted. It was completely busted. I believe it was mostly because there was a bug with Nocturne, but it was busted anyway. Demolition Spat on champions that had low mana cost AoE abilities was busted, because it was so much CC that there was just nothing you could do. Aurelion Soul Protector, there was a point that was completely busted because it cast too much, so it got too much Protector Shield. The general issue is when something is attached to a single target effect that suddenly becomes an AoE effect, or something that wasn't meant to happen like rapidly successively is happening rapidly successively. That's probably where the issues are. So that's why we kind of circle Aurelion Soul and Kaisa. But moving on, the expectation, even though they don't really say it here, I think there's an expectation that we're going to be seeing probably more spatulas next set, but it's not going to be as inherently random as it feels now. You're going to see more spats on carousels and still getting the drops. So while they say similar spatula rates, I suspect that there's going to be more, just because we're going to be seeing more on the carousels. At least that's my opinion, but we'll see. They go over the theme in fantasy. Basically, they like the Galaxy theme. Galaxy theme was okay. Rise of Elements was kind of meh. I didn't play set 1, so I don't know about set 1. I didn't mind Rise of Elements. I thought that was interesting and neat. So we'll see what the next set, Fates, has. And now for the biggest, probably what was the biggest talking point of this article, and that was system changes and champion counts. So, when set 3 dropped, there were a ton of system changes. Drop percentages, gold streaks, player damage, along with other adjustments I can't even remember. It was a lot of changes that added up to being a completely different game that I don't think a lot of people understood. In particular, the win streaks and player damage, that changed quite a bit when we moved into set 3. The problem with this is, at the same time, we saw a bunch of changes to the number of champions in the set. So, this changed all of the roll down percentages. So you had your roll down percentages that were set, but when you were adding champions into the pool, you had increased or decreased chance. When you added sets into the pool, at those particular levels you were adding champions into the pool, you saw a decrease in the amount of odds that you were finding the champion you looked for. So when you had what was originally 52 champions, and then later we got the 57 champions, that blew up the balance. Even though you had a certain percent in your shop of finding a tier 3, the number of tier 3s have changed. So you had lesser chance of finding the tier 3 that you actually wanted. And that was messing with all of these percentage changes and minor adjustments that they had already set. So, what does this mean? So, I'm going to point out, it was too difficult to find 3-cost champions with all these extra champions that they added. So, what does this mean? What is the lasting impact? The next set will have 58 champions, the entirety of the set. So that way, they won't have to change the core systems. This is a good finding. This is something that's good to understand. Throughout the life of a set, they really shouldn't be changing the total number of champions in the set, because that messes with everyone's roll downs. That messes with what are the odds of you finding the champion you want at this particular roll down timing. This is something that I'm glad they're doing, and I'm glad that they have the foresight to understand why they need to do this. So, that said, 58 champions is actually one more than we currently have. I worry that this might be too many champions, because like they called out before, right now, you're not seeing a lot of the 1 and 2 star carries, and I think this is probably going to have an impact on that. Unless the plan is to have more 3-4 cost carries, so that way the balance is out that way. But I don't know about that. I'm not sure what the percentages will say. I'm not sure what we're going to come out with, but I do worry that this number of champions might actually be too many. But we'll see. I'll have faith in Riot for now. The Galaxy's mechanic. So, Galaxy's mechanic, good. Bad Galaxies, bad. It's actually pretty much that simple. The Riot Galaxies, I think the Galaxies mechanic was pretty well received. I think it changed the way you had to play each game, not each game, but a majority of the games. The problem was there was a good number of Galaxies that heavily favored certain builds or heavily favored a particular style of play that was probably a little degenerate. Lilac in particular was one I thought that was really degenerate. You would get, in Lilac, you remember when you just got Kale and it was yay, I win because I have Kale. Yay. That was a little bad. Binary Star powered Cyber a little too hard. Dwarf Planet made Mecha kind of absurd. On Dwarf Planet, Mecha's completely busted. It's triple S tier, and there's really nothing you can do about it. I am interested on what insight Medium and Little Legends had. That I am interested. I'm curious how people played those galaxies differently. My assumption is Medium Legends, everyone just ecoed and rushed 9, whereas in Little Legends everyone rushed 7 and rolled down. That was kind of my assumption on how those two were played, but I'm curious what the numbers say. And yeah, like they pointed out, Lilac adjusted how the game flowed entirely based on what 4 costs you got in the early game with what item. So in the end, they do plan on bringing back this like galaxies mechanic, probably as something different in the future with a later set, mostly just because of how well received it was compared to the elemental tiles in set 2. Probably were not received overly well, and I doubt we're going to see that again. Carousels. Let's talk about carousels. So we lightly talked about carousels before, but we need to talk about carousels some more. Carousels made a lot of rage this set. There are a lot of issues with carousels. To the point that some carousels were jokingly referred to as Mort Dog carousels. Or as I referred to them, the carousel of misfit toys. Because your carousel was basically the 9 worst combined items in the game. And you either had a sword breaker or something worse, because lol, that's how that worked. So we're going to be seeing a change to the carousels, basically based off how much people probably did not like these. Like, here's a good example. No amount of strategic foresight can prepare you for a game where you get 3 full item carousels. So, when you go through your PvE round and you get a bunch of items, you have it already in your mind. What items do I need to complete this build? And then you get to your carousel and it's like, I got a full item carousel. I have no choice in what to build. The advantage of having component items is that it adds a level of strategic tactics to the game. That component can make like 9 other items, whereas a fully completed item is just a fully completed item. You can't do anything with it. That's what you get. Whereas you have choice, you have decision when you pick up a component. When you have the Mort Dog carousel of completed items, you lose that agency. There's no player agency there. You just have to pick the item off the carousel that's left to you that is the most useful to your build. Whereas previously, you took a component that could make the most full items that could be useful to your build, and you had to think about that. There's no thinking on a Mort Dog carousel. You just grab the best item available that might work for your comp. So we're not going to see the Mort Dog carousel anymore. That's been called out quite a bit, is that no more Mort Dog carousel. And in case you didn't know, full item carousels are jokingly referred to as the Mort Dog carousel. Sorry, Mort Dog. I love you. But we are seeing some changes into carousels. Like I said, we won't see full item carousels except for all Force of Nature, which is fine. I mean, Force of Nature carousel is like, yay, party popper. Everyone gets the same item. Or single component item carousels were also kind of miserable existences. The idea is that you need control over the game. Like I said, player agency. You need to be able to choose which component is going to has the best possibility of making your composition better, rather than what item is the best item here. So, we'll see a more predictive style of carousel, so you can anticipate what's going to happen. Essentially, all that means is the carousels are going to be more standardized. So you're going, like I said before, you're going to see 8 item, 1 spat, night item, random item, 5 items, and 4 spats. Like, that's basically going to be it. So you can always plan for, I need this item before you go into the carousel. Or just have a running list of components that are most optimal for your build going into the carousel. Okay? This transitions nicely to the next section, item flexibility, which was kind of what it's kind of the next part of this issue of like terrible items. Set 2 and early set 3 had an issue where your composition focused heavily, and even now, your composition heavily focused on getting one particular item and multiples of that one particular item, or making sure you built one particular item. And if the game decided to offer you a completely different item that was completely useless to your composition, well, that's too bad. That sucks to be you. Now, there were changes made in the middle of set 3 that helped alleviate this. So, the good example is Giant Slayer. Giant Slayer went from being an okay item that on AD builds that wasn't, i.e. Last Whisper, to being something that you could pretty much put on any carry and was pretty good. So when you were running your like spell-based build and you weren't finding your tiers or you weren't finding your rods, but you had some nice swords and bows to work with, you could make a Giant Slayer, and that helped your build. The problem has become, and this is something that I'm hoping that they continue to do. So, like, maybe they get rid of Crit Gauntlet and make IE work with spells as well. That actually sounds insane, and I hope they don't do that. Or they tone down crit damage or something and do that. But that's kind of along the lines. Like, Crit Gauntlet only works with spells. IE only works with AD. If you have those items, they're useless in your build. So, now moving on, there are some items that are just plainly problematic in the game. There are certain champions that if you give specific items to, they just explode all over everyone. They point out Blue Buff and Sojourn. Blue Buff in particular is a pretty nasty one. There's a lot of champions that's DPS basically quadruples if you give them a Blue Buff. Cassiopeia is a good example. Cassiopeia without a blue buff, her damage actually, I believe it more than triples if you give her a blue buff. It's kind of insane how much more damage Cassiopeia does with a blue buff. And same thing with Spear of Sojin on things that have high mana cost, so like Janna. Janna with a Spear of Sojin will just ult endlessly on people, and it's kind of a pain to deal with. I suspect that there's going to be a pretty big rework on mana generation items. That or they just kind of go away. Mostly because the damage the output increases dramatically. Yeah, they literally just pointed out everything I just said. Other items that are kind of similar are like IE. Certain champions with an IE just kind of blow over everyone. So, like, Jhin with an IE just, like, wrecks face. Actually, IE in general on a lot of champions kind of wrecks face. So, I'm hoping that we kind of see some reworks on those items. That said, it's not like it's IE before, where IE on Kha'Zix in set 2 was kind of like, he just one-shotted on his ult every time. And it was kind of absurd, and I loved running it. The other issue with items is when the item gets linked to a trait. Specifically, they call out Warmhogs and Protectors. Yeah, that's kind of the idea. But the issue with this is that it made it so like Warmogs was just optimal on Protectors at all times. Same thing with red buff on blasters or battlecast. It just became the optimal thing to put on them, but it was completely suboptimal anywhere else by comparison. So, what exactly is going to happen now? So, their plan is to make it so that items don't lock you into a composition. That's an interesting thought because that goes against what I personally consider to be one of the number one theories of this game, and that's that you build your composition to your items. You don't you don't grab items for a specific composition you want to play. You take the items you have and you run the composition that the game gives you to work with those items. Forcing in general is suboptimal. You should have like 2 to 3 builds in your mind that you can play with a variety of items. Whether or not this is going to be an effective strategy going forward, I don't know. While I like the idea that's called out up here, where they want to make the items more useful across multiple builds, down here, items that lock you into a build, I don't know if that's going to be a logical way to build items. Like, I'm not sure they're just going to be able to do that. I don't think it's going to be conducive to a good atmosphere to the game, because I think from that point you're just going to see people forcing a single build every game if every single item works in every single build. You have to the game has to give you some message that, hey, composition A will work more for you than composition B. And the two ways of doing that are the shop and the items. So my expectation is that this probably won't really happen, but we will see a bit more of this where items have a little more utility across multiple compositions. But this, I don't know. There's just going to be items that are just going to be infinitely better in some builds than others. That's just how it's going to work out, the way I see it. Quality of life changes. They are good. We should see more of them now that the mobile version has been released. I know there's a lot of things that have been talked about improving the game, just from a UI perspective in general. A lot of people want to see healing done. A lot of people want to see damage mitigated, damage prevented. I'm gonna give I'm not gonna beat down Riot on this one, mostly because this is auto battlers. This genre of game has been in existence for less than 2 years. It's not easy. It's going to take time to figure out what's best, what works, and they're just going to need the time they need to program in these particular things that we want to see. So we're just going to have to give them time. That said, if I had a choice over some of the quality of life changes, UI updates, or a tournament UI, or a tournament client, I would probably take the tournament UI and tournament U client in a heartbeat. I think the game significantly needs better spectator tools for tournament organizers and the ability to host localized tournaments. I think that's kind of just necessary ASAP for this game. I understand that they wanted to build a mobile client first. That's fair. That's understandable. There's money in that. But if we're going to continue to support this game from a tournament side, from a competitive side, then they at least need a tournament client to work from and an efficient spectator mode. That said, I expect spectator mode is going to be a difficult thing to work out. If they release a spectator mode, this would be, to my knowledge, the first auto battler with a spectator mode, with like an actual spectator mode client. So hopefully those things happen, and I'm glad we're getting UI changes. I think the UI change to items, where you can click on the item to see what it makes, that's a great change. That was one of the biggest that's probably the biggest struggle with getting into this game. There's probably a couple struggles getting into the game, but understanding items, what things build, what items you build do, getting past that is an incredible struggle. Now, traits and champions, that's easy. They say on there, hey, this is a protector. I'm just going to play 4 protectors and casually just make that. Oh, I need damage? Well, sorcerers do damage. Alright, so we'll just run protectors and sorcerers, and that'll work out. Yeah. From a casual, you can do that. But the items, that's where it gets iffy. So, like, I have this chain vest and this rod. Well, if I put them ram them together, what does that make? It makes a defensive barrier thing. Okay. That's neat. A cloak and a bow? What does that do? Yeah, it's just jam it together. It makes a hurricane? What the hell does a hurricane do? If it shoots in more shot, what is that? That doesn't make any sense. You get my point. Patching and balancing strategies. So, we've had our up and downs with the patching in TFT this season. We had some good patches. We had some patches that didn't do anything. And we had patches that made the game incredibly narrow and basically only 3 compositions were effective. So what does that mean? Where do we go? How do we keep the game in a more consistent state while at the same time making the game different enough that people keep coming back? Because you don't want the game to be stale for 6 months where nothing changes and everyone's doing the same thing. That's unexciting. That's why people complain about content droughts in various games. You need to have a constantly changing game, and the way that it's done in TFT is just by patching the champions, making different builds better. It's also why we get different sets every 4 to 6 months. So, when they talked about patching, generally the way patching seemed to work this set was that we'd get a minor patch and then a big patch, and then a minor patch and then a big patch. And then the big patch was broken, so we got a bunch of B patches to fix the broken patch. And then we got a minor patch because we did too much last patch and we need to calm the hell down. We need to chill the hell out. And then we got a big patch because we did 2 minor patches in a row and it was like, it was too much. The issue with this was consistency. There just wasn't a lot of consistency. So the plan that they're moving towards, and that they've kind of done near the end of set 3, is they're going to have a patch that has a high-level goal. So, for example, in 10.16, improve underused items. So, certain items got buffed in order to make them better. Static Shiv, I'm trying to remember some of the other items that got buffed in that patch. Static Shiv's the only one that comes to mind. I don't think anyone plays it, but yeah, Static Shiv got buffed. So that was the higher level goal for that. So, and they only changed a handful of other things. And if there was a problem, we drop a B patch. Then they've been more in the habit of dropping B patches in TFT. We've seen a lot more B patches in the past few months, particularly since like the big grotesque Jarvan patch. Ideally, they don't want to, but they need to be able to. So, what is the plan moving forward? So, how do I want to word this? The patching strategy and the direction they seem to want to go is they want to have one big patch and then 2 to 3 smaller patches before dropping another big patch with a lot of major changes. I think that's probably a decent way to go about it. You have your big patch, which makes some trait now playable, makes some items now playable, and then the next 2 patches are kind of minor, just balancing things. You're not going to make one comp straight up infinitely better. You're just going to tone some of the too good things down, maybe bring up some of the really weak things. And then you get to the point where you have another big patch, and boom, we blow up the meta again. So essentially, my thought is they're going to be blowing up the meta every month and a half by dropping this bomb that makes a certain item or certain comp much better, now playable, and you just shove it into the current meta with all of the other compositions. And something's going to fall out of the bottom, and it's going to insert itself somewhere in the middle or on top. Seems okay. It'll keep some excitement in the game and keep the meta rotating enough for people to be interested in. It also helps evolve from having what I'm going to air quote as solved metas. I think in set 3 we probably really only had one straight up solved meta where it was 100% clear what the best compositions were, and depending on the items you had, determined whether or not that composition beat the other compositions. That was back when we had the Riven Sork, Cyber, and what was the other one? Sniper? I think it was Sniper. Yeah, that was bad meta. But hopefully they'll have a cadence where big patch changes the meta just juggles around a bit till it gets steady again. Have a couple patches to fix any issues, and then boom, big patch again, we juggle the meta. Now, it's not so big that everything's going to be displaced, but they're probably just going to take 1 or 2 comps, just shove them into the middle of the current meta and see where they land. So that's pretty much it for this. I wanted to go through this because I thought that there was a lot of good insights into how Riot's viewing the game and what directions they're planning on going. A lot of good hope. I'm going to say that's kind of my four-letter word of my job, hope. That these changes lead to a little more consistency in the game and some better development of things like champions and better systems in the game. Because I was a little worried when we came into set 3 and they jumbled up all of the game systems between drop rates, shot percentages, gold. I was a little worried when they did that at the beginning of set 3, and it took them some time, and it took the players some time to understand what those did to the game. So hopefully we see less of that and more of just, we're going to shuffle the meta a little bit. That would be my goal. Anyway, that's it for this video. It was way too long, but this article was pretty long, so I wanted to go through it and kind of give my thoughts and kind of give an understanding of how I view the direction Riot's going in. Overall, I think it's good. I think the direction that they have towards TFT is good, but I do want to make sure that we get that tournament client and that, because this game does have a decent competitive scene, and I think those players they really deserve a right to showcase how good they are at this game. And hopefully this game gets a good competitive following. Anyway, that's it. I'm out. I'm going to start playing some games. Peace.